So you're speaking to something that I find rather interesting that I've seen at a couple of different tables. Not at tables that I've played at, but at tables that I've seen through other media, which is starting at level 0. And this is, for me, in this scenario, it's just kind of an expression. You're not actually starting at level 0. I'm pretty sure everybody's like level 3 or something in this campaign. But level 0 is kind of the jump start to the whole campaign. It's the origin story. It's the inciting incident for why the characters become adventurers in the first place. I think it's really interesting because you're integrating the premise of your backstory without diving into super specific things, and you're allowing yourself to build that backstory at session 1 as opposed to having to write it out like I do from session 0 or something like that. So I usually come to the table with a backstory prepared that's maybe a couple pages long, but that's just because I like writing fiction and I think it's cool. But I've seen in D&D Beyond articles actually that many people are looking at the front story and what that means. The front story is like you have an idea about your character, but you don't really need anything concrete to get the game started. And so when you play the game, it becomes much more rewarding because you explore that front story and it becomes the origin story of your character, which is different from the backstory. The backstory has already happened, more or less. So in this campaign, it's like, oh, my character is a guard. So let's explore the origins of what my character would be like as a guard. What do they do on their shift? And what do they see on their shift? Is there an inciting incident or do they go normal? And I think that's pretty neat. I think that's a really cool way to give players agency in how their character is situated in the world around them, as opposed to trying to integrate the backstory of the character into a pre-made world, especially in this campaign where social interaction is the priority. Whereas so many other campaigns that I've played, I try to strike a balance between combat, social interaction, and exploration. But that's just because I kind of get bored if I do one thing too much. So like in Grey Owl's Legacy, I was doing a lot of really cool social interaction stuff and role-playing with Rowan, my level 20 character. But after a while, it was like, all right, I'm done with that part because it's like it's time to move on. You know, it's not we're not in a soap opera, so we don't need to keep saying, oh, but then the brother shows up with his evil twin, and it's like, okay, now we have to talk to those guys, I guess, or whatever. And if you're into that, that's fine. But like, for me, D&D is like, I still want to be on an adventure. And an adventure to me is defined as like going out and exploring the world out from the central hub that I am already at. And that's just my play style. But I'm really glad to hear that you are finding energizing experiences in this other play style, which is mostly social interaction. And it speaks to the appeal of political intrigue, cloak and dagger campaigns, and things like that. Isn't there a different one that has to do with courts? I think there's one. I don't know. But yeah, so like, I think it's really cool how that's working out. And you asked the question, what kind of people does a world full of magic and adventure make? And I just want to put my 2 cents in, which is that I think that the people aren't really any different from the people in our world. And the reason for that is that let's speak for humans, I guess, specifically, because I don't know any elves, you know, so, but if we speak to humans specifically, people normalize their lives once things become stable and predictable. So even people, let's just take some extremes, people who live in Siberia where the cold gets below like 10 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, every day, even during the daytime, or people who live in Hawaii on active volcanoes, we've seen what happens when those volcanoes blow up, and we've seen what happens to the society when the magma is flowing and everything. But during normal times, when nothing's going on with those volcanoes, they're just doing their normal stuff. So they might be living around the volcano, like making it a central thing that they build their life around. But in general, people look for normalcy. They look for predictability in their lives. And I think that's pretty interesting when you apply that to fantasy, because it means that even in a world of adventure and magic, stable families can exist. and you just build your life around the ability to use magic, or the ability to go out on an adventure and hunt down a monster or something like that that's been hurting your town, because you want to restore that normalcy, or anything like that. That's why academies exist. That's why we imagine that guilds exist, because guilds, academies, and all those things are ways to rationalize and normalize a world that is generally chaotic. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. To go off of what you're saying, Ian, we've talked about this group, this campaign, both kind of on the podcast and off in a few different ways. And there's a lot of value to this kind of approach. But the reason there's a lot of value, and this is where it's going to start, this is going to be potentially controversial, and I'd love to hear what everyone's reactions to this are, is that what it's doing is establishing a metagame structure that is clearly metagaming in order to create a more compelling narrative. And I think I've had a lot of conversations where, there's this idea that's both printed in the official source materials of the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I've talked with players about this, that authentic narrative D&D play is at odds with metagaming. And I am of the opposite opinion, and my experience tells me the opposite, which is the best narrative D&D games aren't the ones where we hide a metagame structure, it's where we lean into it. So one of the things Adam has been saying a lot is that the group that he just ran, this was a session 0.5. And my inquiry is, what makes this 0.5 versus a session 1? And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. But when you call it a 0.5 for the players, because again, this is creating a specific kind of experience for this group, there is a different level of there's a different kind of expectation based on the shift in language that allows them to metagame in a different way. So for these players, what I'm surmising or inferring is that by calling it a session 0.5, they aren't expecting a central conflict, that they can actually approach it in a relaxed way where they don't even have the expectation that there's anything that's really going to happen. And really what this allows for is a slice of life. And the other thing that a slice of life lets you do is, from a metagaming standpoint, it allows the players to empathize with everybody else's characters in a way that you really can if you start things in the middle of things. So, they talk about this in classical literature, how a lot of epics, like epic poems, start in the middle of things. Like the Odyssey is a really good example of this, where the Trojan War is already over. Odysseus is hanging out in a cave, doing lewd things with a demigoddess. Like, you're not starting when he was a kid and learn something from his dad and his mom, right? And like learned how to be a tactician and then fought in the war and then after the war. In a lot of ways, Star Wars is the same thing, where we pick up, George Lucas has said that the original 6 episodes were really the tragedy of Darth Vader. Darth Vader was the central character of that epic story, and we start in the middle of his journey to redemption, right? Luke Skywalker isn't actually the hero, it's Darth Vader. But if we look at Luke Skywalker as the hero, we start with him as just a moisture farmer who wants to go to Toshi Station to pick up some power converters. Like, we start seeing Luke in kind of a mundane light, and we watch his ascent to herohood to the point that, you know, by the time we get around to like episode 7, if we count that, or we get to like The Mandalorian, you know, people speak about Luke Skywalker in hushed tones. And the Empire sees him basically as like a domestic terrorist because this one guy with a laser sword took out an AT-AT all by himself just by just like hopping in and tossing in a thermal detonator. Like, so there's this idea that when what this group values, and I've played with them, and from hearing your like kind of reflective report on how the session went, what I'm gathering is that this group, it's easier to empathize with everyone else's characters when you can see their story play out as a player. When they don't have that, it makes it so much harder for them to be open and vulnerable with their character to other characters.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.